Okay, thanks very much. Let's get started. We are short one member of this panel. Bruce Jones has a health issue that has come up at the last moment and is unable to join us.
It's his time.
We're going to take that. We're going to see at the end whether there's any time left. In some senses, this is the unpopular panel. We're dealing here with international security, and it seems that one thing the finance departments don't want the G20 to deal with is international security. But the world has become ever more integrated. We're all ever more connected. Governance has become ever more complex, and it's become ever more difficult. Everything is connected to everything else, and good governance has become an end in itself, not just a means as it used to be. The UN and the Bretton Woods institutions are necessary but not sufficient. A lot of water has gone under those respective bridges since they were created. And the G20 is potentially the most important new innovation since 1945. Potentially, but not yet in reality, I don't think. It needs to be both a crisis group and a global steering group. In the latter context, it needs to deal also with issues, in my judgment, that go beyond the ones that it's dealing with now. I must say that when one sees how much time we bring together heads of state and heads of government, speaking something like 18 different languages, and the seriousness of the issues that they're dealing with, there is a disconnect between the seriousness of the issues and the seriousness with which they're treated. It's amazing to me that you could bring these leaders together for less than a full day of discussion. One of the reasons why you can't discuss other things on this agenda besides whatever the current crisis is because there's not enough time to discuss other things on the agenda. Security is not a crisis, and I would say happily, security is not a crisis. I would remind people that there are, according to reliable estimates, 22,000 nuclear weapons, 8,000 operational nuclear weapons, some good number of which are on a hair trigger, which could arrive in this locale in about 20 minutes from somebody making a mistake. If there ever was a nuclear crisis in the world, a nuclear weapons crisis in the world, people will be pleased, people will long for the day when all they had to deal with was a financial meltdown. And there are other issues that are extremely important. Nuclear safety, one saw what the economic impact of Fukushima and the human impact. Cybersecurity, not on anybody's agenda. The Arab Spring or the Arab Revolt, the responsibility to protect Libya, for example, terrorism, crime and drugs. All of these are issues which could be beneficially looked at, direction given by heads of government. In the 2008 Washington communique, it actually signaled an intention to deal with a broader agenda than it has ended up dealing with, including, I quote, rule of law and terrorism. President Sarkozy last year said that, quote, completing the work that is underway is important in the G20. The G20's dependability or sort of credibility depends on it, but is it enough? And the answer is, in my judgment, it's not enough. The G20 has necessarily stuck to economics, but sooner or later, it will need to broaden its agenda. We don't have much advice, I don't think, at this table for Lourdes and the meeting in Mexico 1 year hence. But this conference is also about filling the gaps in international governance, and that's what we will be addressing now. And when I talk about the gaps, I mean gaps in international institutions, but also gaps in international legislation, so to speak, treaties, practices. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at. And in a second round here, we're going to talk about research priorities. So I invite the people at the table to give some thought to what they'll say in the second round as well as the first. I'm going to start with Trevor Findlay. Trevor is at Carleton University and at CIGI. Currently, he's visiting Harvard University. With Louise Frechette, he produced a landmark study on nuclear energy. And I'd like to ask him, what do you see as the gap or gaps that need filling?
Thank you, Paul, very much. Like the other areas we've been discussing today, there are huge gaps in the nuclear area, but sometimes, and I'll come to this a bit later, I don't think they should necessarily be filled by intergovernmental organizations. There's a role for other players as well. The big gaps are nuclear safety. We saw from Fukushima that we had an international organization, the IAEA, responsible for nuclear safety, but it's like a house where the lights were on but no one was home. Unfortunately, there were mechanisms in place. The new Director General didn't take advantage of them. Japan didn't take advantage of them. So we have an agency which has plenty of potential, but certainly in the Fukushima case did not rise to the occasion. So gaps need to be filled within the furnishing of the IAEA, if you like. They have an action plan. We had copies of that passed around today. That needs to be implemented in all its glory. So if there's anything for the broader international community to do, it's to hold the IAEA and its member states to the fire on this action plan, because there'll be proof in the pudding, as it were. One peculiarity of the nuclear safety regime is how distant it is from the industry that it's supposed to regulate. The interaction between the global governance arrangement and the actual civil nuclear industry is distant at best and suspicious. So there is something to be fixed within that house, if you like, not in the sense of building additional bits, but fixing the relationship between the stakeholders there. On nuclear security, the situation is probably even worse in the sense that nuclear security has many gaps in it. Nuclear security is not an area where we've traditionally expected international organizations to play a role. Certainly the IAEA can and should and is being given additional authorities, but we have a separate process called the Nuclear Security Summits, which is moving towards improving the regime. So again, there's something that in a sense replicates the G20, but is in a completely separate forum, and that is working through various agenda items in the nuclear security field. So there's a gap, but there's a process to fill that. If I could just make a few comments about the house building enterprise in general, it seems to me, and this came up in relation to Greece and having a fund to rescue states needing economic bailouts, is the issue of moral hazard. And this comes about in the particular case of nuclear safety. If we give authority to a global governance institution in a way that leaves operators of nuclear power plants and regulators off the hook for responsibility for nuclear safety, I think that is a bad way to proceed. So we need to, I think the Europeans call it, be aware of subsidiarity and have each level, as it were, be responsible for its own undertakings. And we certainly don't want to let nuclear power operators off the hook for safety by introducing this aspect of moral hazard. Secondly, in the nuclear area at least, regionalism will often work better than a global institution. I'm thinking of things like the Brazil-Argentina mutual monitoring organization, ABAC, and that monitors the nuclear facilities of Brazil and Argentina in a way that they weren't comfortable having the IAEA do in the beginning. So I think we should think regional solutions as well as global governance. And finally, civil society. In my field, there's a great case of the Landmine Monitor. So it's a non-governmental organization that monitors compliance with the Landmine Convention, the Ottawa Convention, in a way that states would feel uncomfortable themselves doing. And so that's a vital piece of the global governance picture for the landmine regime, but it's just not a formal intergovernmental organization.
Thank you. I'll turn now to Paul Meyer. Paul is a fellow in international security at the Simon Fraser University. He's a former ambassador to the UN in Geneva and to the Conference on Disarmament. And I would, in my judgment, he's probably Canada's leading expert on arms control and disarmament questions. He's written a very interesting piece called Function over Forum, in which he talks about how to get the fissile material cutoff treaty, which is stalled in negotiation, how to get it out of the CD and into the hands of people who might actually want to move forward with it. He also was our Director General in charge of cybersecurity, among other things. Paul?
Yes, thanks, Paul. We were asked to sort of focus on one aspect, and I'll have my remarks on cyberspace here, which both as an environment and as a technology has been largely unaddressed from the perspective of global governance. There's little in the way of any normative instruments. There's no agreed division of labor between responsibility centers, and there is no dedicated international organization in charge of it, though there are some claimants to that mantle. The use and abuse of cyberspace impacts across a wide range of global public policy concerns, everything from human rights to law enforcement, from the media and education to international security. And in the cybersecurity realm, the prospect of offensive cyber warfare is very close at hand, and in my estimation cries out for some application of preventative diplomacy. The New York Times had a revealing report a little earlier this month about plans for launching a cyber attack to take down the Libyan air defenses, and the internal debate within the Obama administration about proceeding with this. Fortunately, in my humble opinion, this particular ops plan was put aside with concerns about precedent and that always delicate issue of the president's authority, war-making authority vis-a-vis Congress. But if this had not gone that way, I think it just underscores the dangers that we could face if in the absence of some effort to develop rules of the game for state behavior in cybersecurity, there could be some extremely nasty fait accompli that the international community would have to confront.
And for example?
Well, I will give you an example. I say in this very quintessential realm of asymmetrical warfare, do not assume the response would be an effort to target NORAD's air defenses, but think of the civilian air traffic control system. Think of the municipal water purification systems. Think about our financial exchange systems. We talked about financial crises extensively today. You can imagine if a handful of zeros were added or subtracted to the various transactions in terms of impact on society's well-being and functioning. So we've been told that the G20 should stick to its knitting, and maybe that's correct advice, particularly since several of its products seem to be unraveling as we speak. But we were also enjoined here to consider and identify gaps in international governance. And I would suggest that the cybersecurity field represents a very real gap in international governance, whether or not the G20 deigns to officially add it to its agenda. And I think concerned states, and I would suggest that that is coeval with at least the membership of the G20, not to mention a range of non-state actors, should agitate for the commencement of this global dialogue relating to the development of some initial norms and parameters for the cybersecurity field. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Now I'll turn to Jongryn who is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor at Yonsei University, professor of international political economy. His interest, I think, will be in the role that Tier 2 countries, middle powers, can play in international political and security matters.
Thank you. I will discuss two gaps in global security governance. The one is, as Paul mentioned, the role of middle powers, I guess lack thereof. And the second one is the middle power, the G20, the role of G20. I like to push the idea of G20 doing making contributions to global security in the near future. If not the next summit, but sometime soon, and explore some possibility there. And the reason why I'm interested in middle powers because I think that middle powers are needed to prevent polarization of global governance that is happening already between developed and developing countries, and especially in East Asia, between strategic rivalries between China and the United States. And polarization like this is a big threat to global security, and can easily see this in the nuclear crisis in North Korea. And if you just watch the crisis unfolding, and it's been with us for the last 20 years, and it has proven to be intractable, not because we are lacking in ideas or attention or organization or money. There are countries like Japan and South Korea willing to put in billions of dollars to solve this problem, but because North Korea has become, in the last 10 years, a battleground of US-China rivalry in East Asia. So for China, the stability of North Korean regime is more important than the ending of North Korean nuclear program, which they don't see as threatening their interests, and it's not in the short run. And certainly China does not want to see a strong or unified South Korea aligned, unified Korea aligned with the United States. So to prevent polarization of global governance, middle powers need to organize. And I think we should start with the middle powers at the G20. And one track is to, along the lines suggested by Paul in his a project, the Constructive Powers Initiative. And G20 middle powers can work together on their common security challenges, such as human security, migration, and drug trade. But for middle powers in East Asia, Australians, Indonesians, and South Koreans, Japan is sort of a middle power in East Asia. Rise of China is one easy common challenge they can work together, and they are working together already. The second track is for G20 middle powers to coordinate their policy at the G20. And as you know, the middle powers such as South Korea, Canada, Australia, and Mexico already have made many contributions to the evolution of the G20. And they can be more effective if they can find a way to coordinate more closely among themselves. My second point about a direct role that G20 can play in global security, without actually expanding in them, its mandate to non-finance area. G20 has already worked on money laundering and illicit trade, which must have affected the financing system of rogue states and terrorist organizations. This is kind of something I just came up with. Probably not a very good idea, but one other area we can think of is maybe a G20 can work on the transparency of military expenditures. Now, I say this because finance ministers in every country find their military budget is a big problem. It's a headache to them because they always want more money, and they want to hold their military accountable financially. And perhaps then they can find some rules, multilateral rules, some reporting rules on military spending. They can find them helpful in reining in defense spending in their own country. Some idea. I don't know whether that makes sense. Thank you very much.
That's an innovative idea. Thorsten Benner is the co-founder of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Thorsten, if you were looking at global governance and security from your perspective, what do you see the gaps as being?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you also to the organizers for the invitation. It's my first time in Canada. I'm excited to be here at CIGI. I've interacted with researchers from here for a long time. It's good to be finally here, and the cab driver also reassured me that I had come to the very right place, because he told me that downtown was known as Berlin before the Second World War, and even after it changed for understandable reasons, they found this nice name, Kitchener, it still holds the second biggest Oktoberfest in the world. So I'm in the right place. On the gaps in security, I would like to flag one issue in terms of the division of labor on the panel, and that issue would be the responsibility to protect. 10 years ago, this December, the International Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention produced its report that was also instigated by the Canadians. Lloyd Axworthy played an important role. And at the time when it came out, it was very much overshadowed by the aftermath of 9/11 and the Afghanistan intervention and so on. But I think 10 years afterwards, looking back, we might well conclude that this report and the subsequent discussions prove more consequential than 9/11. We're unraveling a little bit the early steps that we've taken after 9/11, but the responsibility to protect, I think, had its coming out this year only, with a number of events. There was a unanimous vote in the Security Council to invoke the responsibility to protect on the Ivory Coast case. Then there was the landmark, already somewhat more contested Libya resolution. And of course, there were the subsequent debates on the implementation of the Libya resolution, which have led us, among other things, to the vote on Syria, where any sort of measures, even rhetorically against the Syrian regime, were shot down. And that leaves us in a very messy situation. On the one hand, you have a big coming out of this norm. On the other hand, you have an increasing level of contestedness and acrimony among the major powers. And this calls for a debate, among other things, on issues such as the responsibility in protection that the Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff raised in the UN General Assembly, but it calls for a systematic discussion on how the norm is to be interpreted, how it is to be implemented among the major powers. Now, I don't want to suggest to the Mexican presidency or to the Sherpas to take this humongous task upon themselves, but I would suggest to the major powers that are represented in the G20 that they need to think hard about how they pull off that kind of dialogue, because we cannot rely on the UN Security Council to provide that kind of forum, because the UN Security Council, unless it is reformed in a major way, doesn't bring all the major powers to the table. That's why a forum such as the G20 is actually quite congenial, at least to think about the responsibility of these major powers in terms of sustaining a dialogue on what the responsibility to protect means and how we can kind of decrease the enormous tensions that have emerged after the coming out of this norm this year.
Thank you very much. On the responsibility to protect, I guess I could say I was there at the creation. After the catastrophe of Rwanda and Srebrenica, we wanted to, and in light of the view that national sovereignty was paramount and absolute, we asked ourselves, and ultimately Kofi Annan then asked the question publicly, if that's the case, then what are we to do about to protect populations that are being slaughtered by their own governments? And so we launched the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which produced this responsibility to protect thesis. We knew that the Brundtland Commission had been able to reconcile economic growth and environmental protection with the idea of sustainable development, and so we asked the Commission to try to reconcile the idea of national sovereignty and human rights protection, and they did. I do think it's appropriate that I also mention that this report was adopted at the UN in 2005. That was warp speed in international diplomacy because we only handed the report to the UN in 2001. And part of the reason it was passed in 2005 at the summit there was because of the work done by then Prime Minister Paul Martin, because without his intervention, it probably would not have passed, and then nothing would have happened at that summit of 155 countries. At least in this particular case, we got a norm established, and 5 years after the establishment of the norm, we now have its implementation to some extent or another. David Shorr is Program Officer of the Stanley Foundation. He's done extensive work on the G20, on R2P, on nuclear safety. David, what do you see as the gaps?
Thanks, Paul. I'd actually like to pick up on what you were saying before about a broader remit for the G20. Let's recall that the G20 is the premier forum for rising powers and established powers international cooperation. Of course, I'm twisting around the Pittsburgh communique, which said something like that, but not exactly. But if you think of rising powers, or when we think about rising powers, or talk about rising powers, we don't talk about it as a purely economic phenomenon. Of course, they're the major emerging economies, but their rise does have a set of political concerns and implications as well. So, in arguing then for the G20 to deal with more issues, I guess the concern, and we've talked about it a lot here today, is distraction. But I want to raise the question, well, what are the key factors for distraction, right? I mean, what makes something distracting? I would say it's not a heterogeneity of a lot of different issues. I would say that it's not that an issue is new to the G20. I would say that the key factor is, what does an issue actually ask of the leaders, right? We've had a very sophisticated discussion here today that understands that the G20 does very little itself in the sense of following through or carrying out, that it's woven in with a lot of other intergovernmental organizations that carry out a lot of the work. And so, if we do understand that this is meant to be leaders providing only what they can, then that means, I think, we should be able to allow a little bit more. If I agree, as I do, with Prime Minister Martin from last night, saying that economic growth and financial stability is going to be something of a slow and an incremental slog, then I think that leaves space. I think that there is bandwidth for the leaders that they can take on some additional topics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm of two minds now. I think I would like to open up the floor to some discussion, or some discussion amongst us, and then open up the floor. And in the process, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think the research work that might need to be done is. Try to identify things which think tanks in this room might be able to contribute to. And to start off the discussion, I think I'd like to pick up again on David's last point, and that is, we're going to have a nuclear summit on nuclear safety. It has almost the same membership, or largely overlapping membership, as the G20. We're bringing all of the leaders together in a G20 context. Why does it make sense to tell them not to deal with these issues when they're together in a G20 context, but it's all right, in fact necessary, for them to focus on these issues when they meet as another group? People talked about intervention fatigue. There's also, if I were, I think, a head of government, I'd be having summit fatigue, and have long since had it. The Europeans seem to meet not once a month, or not even once a week. They seem to meet bi-weekly these days. Canadian Prime Minister has at least 12 summits a year. I know that President Obama has complained, and certainly President Bush before him complained about the number of summits he had to attend. I don't quite understand the rationale for saying that we must stick to economics at the G20 summit until such time as we've really got that licked, and then maybe we'll think about something else. If I were a leader of a government, I think I would want to, when I see my counterparts across the table, and I'm worried about a Fukushima, for example, supposing there had been a G20 at about that time, you think they would not have talked about the nuclear safety issue? I think that's not very likely. Why is it that we at the officials level, as it seems to be, when I hear people talking, seem to want to keep the leaders focused on compartmentalize the use of their time? Paul, can you imagine a situation in which how would you see the G20 at leaders level giving a direction, for example, not doing it themselves, but what sort of direction might they give the officials on cybersecurity, for example? What would be a constructive outcome at a G20 meeting?
Well, Paul, as I think you've intimated, at the summit level, there will be political discussion of the issues of the day, and there has to be some room for that. I think as well, the political signal, as it was put, it can be useful in and of itself. I know I'm conscious in the G8 context, for instance, there was some very useful messaging that came out prior to the NPT review conference of last year. Something akin to that would be helpful. It's a little more of a challenge in a context where there's not a clearly identifiable institution to sort of hand or task with the follow-up, and that is a complicating feature. But even an expression of political acknowledgement that the issue demands attention, and that creates an environment in which there can be initiatives both at the national level or in other entities to take some work forward. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate function, and it doesn't have to go too deeply into the subject matter to have the utility of that political direction.
Trevor.
Thanks, Paul. I can see that, for instance, had Fukushima happened while the G20 was meeting, then it would have been perfectly reasonable for the G20 to issue a statement on that and tell the International Atomic Energy Agency and other bodies involved to get on with the job, to steel their nerve, as it were. But I can see Lourdes frowning every time someone suggests more onto the G20 agenda. I just think from a very practical point of view, the G20 meetings have got a limited amount of time, a limited amount of expertise on their delegations. One thing we discovered with the Nuclear Security Summit was we brought a lot of countries together, and some of them didn't have a single expert on nuclear security, and these were, of course, in many cases, the developing countries. So what you need for those sorts of summits, they're very technical, they're new, they really need a lot of preparation in advance, and they need quite a substantial delegation and technical advice to the delegation. Otherwise, we end up with a situation where the developing countries who don't have this huge range of expertise are disadvantaged, whereas the great powers come along, of course, with their array of experts. So I think we need good preparation for these particular summits. And in the G20 context, I think they simply get swamped and delegations not be able to cope with the complexity of it. They are not easy things to deal with in the nuclear field. That would be my argument for not rolling it into the G20.
Jongryn.
I see two reasons why it's hard for G20 to expand its mandates. One is domestic politics, and the finance ministries will really want to keep it as a finance minister meeting. But that can change because G7 also started as a finance ministers meeting, then later on added other issues. So I think that can be overcome, I think. But the second reason I think that's more harder to solve is the division of labor between G7 and G20. And everyone is now saying is that G7 focuses on political issues and G20 that handles economic issues. So if G7 disbands, then I think like G20 will naturally be able to pick up more issues.
Do you think there's an appetite in places like Beijing for an expansion, or do you think that they're fixed on a more narrow agenda? Would the Chinese support a broader agenda?
As far as I know, no, they don't want it at the moment. But but other countries who want more more agendas for the G20, I think the G7 is a constraint.
Although I think recent experience is that the Chinese position isn't necessarily fixed, right? I mean, there are plenty of things, economic rebalancing among them, that they had long-standing positions of refusing to discuss, and then eventually, felt uncomfortable from the accumulated pressure.
Paul, I can see the danger of overloading agendas. I can also see the leader fatigue. If I were Obama and had to listen to, at NATO summits, to pre-scripted declarations of the whole list of NATO members, and that steals my time, I would be fatigued as well. But couldn't you think of, in terms of the format of G20, bringing all these leaders together and having one wildcard session per meeting, like a jazzy session like we had over lunch, where you bring up a new topic, you don't allow your aides to really script you and brief you, and you confront the leaders with an emerging issue, and they have to have an open, honest discussion on it that is not pre-scripted. I think that idea steals an hour of their time, but I think it might be worthwhile in terms of instigating a bit of thinking in the leader's mind. So perhaps that kind of jazzy element could be thought of. You asked also about the track 2 in terms of what think tanks, research institutions could do. I think on the issue I talked about, the responsibility to protect, is absolutely essential that we build this kind of track 2 network of think tanks, research institutions in the established powers of the West, and also in the rising powers, that you have an open, honest discussion and try to come to common understanding or a clear disagreement on these issues. And I think that also means that to meetings such as this one, we need to think hard about getting participants from Brazilian institutions, from Indian institutions, from Chinese institutions who kind of represent the think tank world there to the table and involve them in the discussion. That's our only chance to really have a substantive debate among all the powers that matter.
Gordon Smith.
Looks like Gordon Smith. Thank you. It's great to be sitting next to Gordon because you get the floor first.
Well, in your particular case, I didn't know you were there because you're sitting behind number 6. I didn't see you.
That's my secret weapon. No, I just wanted to make a comment which I've made before, and that is that of the issues that the panel has put on the table, from my perspective, there are some which are clearly not ideal to bring into a G20 context, either because they already have an institutional framework that is meant to be dealing with them. R2P is certainly one of those. I mean, there's a whole institutional framework that was set up. It isn't working, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. Well, the UN, I mean, in the UN, it was a whole issue there. Nobody wants to take advantage of the UN framework, but it certainly is there. But there is one issue which was brought up when we were talking about cybersecurity, or when you're talking about money laundering or other issues that have to do with transnational organized crime. And it is, from my point of view, a very clear area in which the G20 should be working, because nobody else is working on it. The specifics of money laundering, yes, but the issue of the global threat posed by organized international crime and criminal organizations, most of whom are involved in cybersecurity and hacking and other issues, including drug trafficking, are not being addressed at a global level, at a global political level, and that is something that I think the G20 could and should be doing. The question is when. Is it appropriate to bring it into the agenda? I thought and think that because the next summit after Cannes is in Mexico, and given the fact that we are a country that is very clearly being affected by transnational organized crime, it would be a very good moment to bring it to the table. Now, this, just as a side comment, I think as we talk about agenda items for the G20, there are two different ways to deal with an agenda item. One is to formally put it on the table, prepare for it, make all sorts of working groups to deal with it, and that's what has been done up until now for each of the agenda items that has been put on the agenda. Another thing that summit leaders can do while they're meeting is to sit down for 15 minutes or a half hour or whatever and discuss an issue which is not necessarily an agenda item, but on which they can make a pronouncement. Fukushima would have been a clear indication of something on which they might have made a pronouncement if it had happened during a summit. But you don't have to put the issue on a formal agenda in order for the G20 leaders to discuss it. The Eurozone crisis as such is not on the agenda of the G20, yet undoubtedly they will be discussing it at Cannes. So I think we should try to keep those two things in mind. And again, I think what was said earlier today about not getting the G20 to get involved in issues which already have mechanisms and institutions that are meant to deal with them. If those institutions and mechanisms aren't working, get rid of them.
Would you make that case for the IMF?
Well, that's a personal question. I mean,
no, it's not. It's an institutional question.
Well,
you said it shouldn't be something that's going to be dealt with in another institution, and if that institution isn't going to deal with it, you should get rid of it.
Well, either that, or you should bring it to heel to explain why it isn't doing what the G20 already told it had to do. I mean, there are clear instructions from the G20 to the IMF, some of which have not been fulfilled.
I think part of the problem is the instructions are to the same, it's the same people sitting around the table. And it's instructions to themselves, which they think they can ignore if they don't like them.
But
table.
Just quickly on that, yeah. I think underlying Andres' point is in the spirit of what I was trying to get at, which is understanding the different kinds of things that leaders can do, different ways that what bothers me about the debate about distraction is that everything is sort of lumped together, that it's all distracting. And I think the clearer picture that we have of just those kinds of options and relationships and different places that issues stand and what they need, I think gives us a much better picture.
The next question is from table 7.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a question to Paul Meyer and cybersecurity again. I did not read the New York Times report he mentioned, but I have recently been very impressed by a Financial Times article. This article gave a relatively precise description of a possible cyber attack on the power distribution grid of advanced economies with economically very destructive consequences. And my impression was similar to the one I got at lunch about geoengineering. Technology is ripe, it's efficient, it's cheap. So I have two questions. What, in terms of targets or likelihood, what is the reality of this threat directed against economic interests? Second, the article emphasized the mutual suspicion between China and the US as a very important source of possibly not starting to design the security framework you mentioned at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jacques. I think in terms of the rarity, it's hard to make any kind of definitive statements because the potentiality is there. At the same time, there's work on the cyber defense side, but I think it is clearly a realistic enough scenario that it should not be discounted. And it underscores, again, the need for some a greater international cooperation in the efforts to combat this. And here I have a particular concern regarding state behavior, because there's, of course, a large-scale cyber crime element, and there's also a subset cyber terrorism element that needs to be combated. There's a certain common interest within the international community on doing that. And it's, I think, not coincidental that the very first baby steps, if you will, towards cooperation and developing of agreements, international agreements, have to this date largely focused on combating cyber crime, the non-state actor who's engaged in malevolent behavior. But your second question brings the spotlight on another potentially even worse grouping, and that is state conflict, interstate conflict. And indeed, the suspicions and very low levels of trust between actors like the United States and China has direct implications here, and reinforces, in my mind, the imperative to develop at a minimum a dialogue between these two actors, and ideally more purposeful steps to begin to have some agreed rules of the road, game rules, if you will. There was a very progressive, though it seemed to have got lost almost immediately, policy statement out of the Obama administration regarding an international cybersecurity strategy. It essentially calls for the collegial and collective development of norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And I think that's a very encouraging sign. But it's one thing to articulate that as a goal. It's something else to actually to invest in its practical realization. And I've seen a little sign of any follow-up to that strategy on behalf of the United States, or indeed other major powers. So yes, I think there's a role in terms of framing the problem, and I think some initial efforts are being done here, but it's also clearly essential that we develop the mechanisms and the process for some interstate cooperation before we have this environment totally compromised and we have to go into the much more costly and painful efforts at trying to, sort of in an arms control fashion, claw back and restrict actions that have already taken place and for which you have built up inherent vested interests within military establishments, for example, to go forward in that way.
Table 1 is the next table, please.
Thank you. This actually picks up very much on the last question. So it's to Paul Meyer on the challenges of using the G20 as a forum for dealing with cybersecurity. You know, the Russians have proposed an arms control agreement, which has met with some skepticism on the part of the United States. And it seems to me that there are difficulties in traditional arms control agreements in this realm, partly because the technologies are obviously widely available, and there's obviously the problem of attribution. And I wonder whether or not going forward and thinking about, you know, whether it's within the G20 context or some other, one has to disaggregate the problem slightly. In the realm of crime and terrorism, as you pointed out, I think there you have a common interest amongst basically most of the players. That there would be a mutuality of interest there too. And then you have, as you pointed out, the difficulty of the, almost in a sense, laws of war issues. What constitutes an armed attack and what's a legitimate target on the part of governments were they to engage in cyber warfare. And then, but the thing that makes it really complex, in my view, is the competing visions here between the vision of cyberspace in open political communities like the United States, but like most of the OECD world, which would prefer to keep the internet largely anonymous, open, and in private hands, compared to particularly that vision promoted in China, but also conceivably Russia and some others, which is a vision predicated on closure and state control, including the persecution of dissidents. So that makes it very, very difficult to envision the G20 necessarily as being a forum for that, or having a treaty that sort of embraces all elements of that. And so it made me wonder whether or not you might start with a like-minded group of countries if you were thinking about codes of conduct, at least in some of those realms, sort of like a FATF type arrangement, which you started with like-minded folks and could engage in some naming and shaming for violators. But I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those thoughts, Stuart. And it also ties in with what Paul Heinbecker had raised about two productive research agendas, because you mentioned about the laws of armed conflict, and clearly one outstanding aspect here is how is cyber attack to be interpreted in the light of the existing laws of armed conflict. Clearly, it would be, I think, advantageous if it could be recognized as being integrated into those. And it is important, of course, also for international humanitarian law in terms of the respect for non-combatants, et cetera. And I think there's some initial work going on at some centers on this and trying to see if a consensus could be developed, and so that would be a beneficial element of it. Yes, to some degree, as in so many areas, you might expect the initiative to be taken a little more by a subset of like-minded groups. Clearly, when we're talking about cyberspace, though, it impacts every nation that is, currently on the globe. So and all of the G20 nations would have something at stake here. Though, again, particularly with this potential offensive use of cyber, it's a smaller subset of states that have established, but unfortunately a growing number now establishing, for instance, cyber commands within their respective militaries, and you can be sure they're busy developing contingency plans, and yet there's complete absence of a parallel diplomatic dialogue regarding these matters. Your point about is it possible to cooperate when there are still some fundamental differences, regarding freedoms of expression, fundamental freedoms within. I would draw from some of the, again, the arms control legacy, which I think has some applications here, and clearly there were efforts at controlling the nuclear arms race, reinforcing strategic stability between states that had fundamentally different internal systems. And I think you're right that treaties here, I think, are for the far distance, but there's a lot of important arrangements, confidence-building measures that could be developed. And again, the analogy to some of the steps that were put into place in terms of nuclear risk reduction arrangements, incidents at sea, codes of conduct that were below the treaty threshold, but proved helpful, and even some comprehensive strategic dialogues between some of the leading powers here, all can contribute, I think, to some enhanced security in this realm and should be actively followed up on.
Thorsten, you had...
Just two quick words of caution on the interesting like-minded approach that Stuart proposed. First of all, this seems to me more easily said from the vantage point of a power that through private or public means still controls much of the architecture of the internet. And second of all, I think it's precisely the point with of course, the strategic issues that come close to cyber war issues. You, of course, need to talk to your antagonists, which are, by definition, mostly not like-minded countries. And I think also a lot of the commercial issues, as you said, there's common interest, at least, that you should try to at least get a common frame of reference against cybercrime and so on with countries that have a different attitude toward freedom of expression, I think. So I'm a little skeptical on this kind of, on how far the like-minded approach will really get you.
Table 3, please.
So Paul asked earlier, why not put more on the G20 agenda? What was the skepticism? And I wanted to respond to that and pose a question about it, which is, this is not the G5 sitting by the fireside. And if one thinks about the reality of the amount of time and structure of a G20 conversation, as much as some of the kind of free-flowing 15 minutes about something sounds nice, what that means in practice is that two leaders have said something from set pieces and we're out of time. So I have a skepticism in part because of the structure, and if we could actually go back to the original vision of an L20, I would be much less skeptical of it. My greatest fear is a G20 meeting in which every leader leaves saying, I actually have no common interests with the people around the room about the things we talked about. And my fear with the issues that are on the table at the moment is finding enough common political interest to structure a conversation where leaders leave feeling like progress was made. And my question is, do we think that is the case? As we thought about it, from the State Department perspective, it was really hard in this space, and that's why you got the side statement at Pittsburgh about Iran and not have it dealt with more centrally. So can we find enough common interest to in fact make it worth the discussion in the highly constrained format that a G20 summit is?
I'll take that bait, Bill. I think we would find more agreement than it appears in terms of having filters, right? My argument is not against applying discipline to selecting topics, right? And you do need the prospect of success. I mean, that's got to be one of the main filters. So it isn't so much that I'm arguing in the near term for a lot of stuff to be added from every which direction. The reality is that that kind of major quantum leap in broadening is a medium-term prospect at best. But what I am saying is that the discussion now to reverse the trend, right, to stop and go back and just, get onto those core agenda items, I would argue against, because I do think that, as I say, the bandwidth is there. But returning to another thing that Paul said is that perhaps we can all agree that a very helpful thing for everything that we're talking about here is to have longer summits. It will only help and is only reasonable to be looking for, let's say, 2 full days to deal with what they're dealing with.
The Commonwealth meets for 4 or 5 days, and the leaders largely, not in every case, perhaps not even in ours, but they tend to be there for that. If you're dealing with really important issues, why is it that, and you have 20 participants, and actually you have a lot more than 20, but say it's 20, 18 different languages, how could you possibly deal with that in a sensible, in anything other than a peremptory sort of way? The second point I guess I would make is, isn't there a steering group role as well as a sort of agreement reaching role? I mean, a crisis management role? Isn't there something that can be, isn't it the case that the leaders can launch some consideration of a subject? They don't have to just agree on whatever the product is, but they can actually launch a discussion. And someone was talking about working groups. I think it was Andres was talking about working groups. Well, you can create a working group on cybersecurity, for example. And I think that it may turn out that that's will be a prescient sort of thing. I would think that in going forward, a Russian summit or whoever gets a summit next, a Turkish summit, a summit beyond that, it strikes me as unlikely that they will still be dealing with exactly the same economic issues that we're dealing with now. I think that the agenda is going to evolve, and it should evolve in ways that deal with the kind of issues that could be catastrophically important, in my judgment. Table 6 is next.
Thank you very much. I wanted to continue Trevor's example of the nuclear safety regime and go back to remarks that I made at the end of the session this morning about resistance to global agreements because of domestic politics. I think there's another factor here which is protecting sovereignty, basically, rather than moving to responsible sovereignty. And the example precisely is the example that Trevor and I both have spoken about the IAEA action plan and the ability or inability of there to be significant progress on establishing standards and norms internationally for independent nuclear regulatory authorities. And it occurs to me that part of the problem here is not so much eagerness on the part, and Trevor's enlightened me a bit on this, but I had the same sense myself, is that not over-eagerness on the part of, say, the US, China, and Japan, just to pick 3 countries, to actually have their nuclear regulatory authorities strengthened by conforming to international norms. And when you stop to think about it, it's absolutely essential that you have a process like this. Otherwise, the whole system is only as good as the weakest national regulatory arrangement. So, and there's a real reluctance, I think, for leaders, for regulators, to agree to have outside interference in setting the bar of how strong their systems have to be. And this is a major undercutting of the arrangement itself. And then you add to it the fact that the World Association of Nuclear Operators just met in Shenzhen, China, last week. And what I think I read from that is that the operators themselves aren't so eager to be in collusion with the regulators. They want to be independent of them because they operate the things. They're the responsible authorities. So you end up with this. The reason I raise this is it has greater generality than just this. Obviously, the whole movement towards establishing financial regulatory standards is subject to the same sort of pressures. So the limits are not whether the agenda is too broad or too narrow, is not about whether the G20 leaders are agreeing or not, but it's a question of the reluctance, I think, of national authorities, whether they be leaders themselves, or in this case, nuclear operators, or nuclear regulatory authorities, or financial regulatory authorities, to be forced to levels of oversight, supervision, and regulation that they're not deciding on themselves. So I just throw that out. Trevor, please disagree if I've put it wrong.
Thanks. No, you've hit the nail on the head, except there are some elements, I think, which have made the situation worse, in that, in this case, states, the members of the International Atomic Energy Agency, have taken upon themselves to be in charge of the issue of nuclear safety, where really the operators are also involved, the industry that builds the plants are involved, the regulators are involved. So it's diplomats not wanting to get their hands dirty with industry. It's like the old British attitude, we won't get involved in trade. It's that sort of a thing. They regard themselves as above the industrial fray, and the relationship between the agency and industry has been distant and in some cases poor. So in some sense, it's a case of building the relationship between an industry and the regulators and the international community, which has tended to regard itself above the fray. So I think we have to change this attitude that many diplomats have, that somehow they're not going to get their hands grubby with commerce and industry. We really do need to integrate all the stakeholders into this nuclear business. So that's one part of the puzzle. But you're right, there's also the question of sovereignty. States are reluctant to give up their sovereignty. The regulators want to keep their little regulators club, and usually it's based on the type of technology. It's not a worldwide technology, so there's a can-do regulators group, for instance. And then you've got the industry itself, which wants to keep track of its commercial secrets. So there's this confidentiality aspect as well, which is getting worse over time with the new generations of nuclear power reactors and the enormous amounts of money to be made if you're one of the leading companies to get into this nuclear revival. So in a way, this sounds like the financial debate we had this morning.
That's what I was going to say. This sounds exactly the same. All of the same considerations seem to be at play. There's one last, Paul?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on a theme that Trevor touched upon, but in fact I think applies right across our whole discussion today, and that is the deficit in accountability that relates to many of the commitments that are undertaken by member states. And I think if we want to see more effective implementation of those commitments, we should be looking at accountability mechanisms throughout the organizations that deal with issues. And here there will always be that tension between state-to-state sovereignty and, you might say, the broader interests of the international community. But through improved accountability mechanisms, I think we can, as Trevor described it, hold the feet of member states to their engagements. And I think that applies as much in the nuclear security, nuclear disarmament realm as it does in the financial, agricultural, and developmental spheres. And if we, again, want to add to our list of research topics, I'd suggest really focusing on what seems to work as implementation accountability mechanisms and what doesn't, or what are the impediments to having them work more fully. And maybe we can get some enhanced compliance and delivery on commitments through that approach. Thank you.
You wrote of the same issue about the accountability of, in this case, of international organizations.
Oh, yes. But I want to say something different. This, in thinking about the future agendas of the G20, I think one thing we may have overlooked today is the G20 is what G20 is good at. I think G20 is good at dealing with cross-cutting issues that the one international organization cannot deal with. Since everything is so closely related and linked these days, and financing is part of every problem, so sooner or later, it's a matter of time that G20 will have to deal with all these issues we have discussed. About the accountability, yes, I agree with Paul that I think Brian, who didn't come, he also said that in his remarks that we have no way of knowing who's doing a good job among managers of international organizations, and I think that makes a lot of observers very frustrated.
Thank you. We have time for two quick questions, and then I'd like to one round around the table with each participant, if they can, setting out an area where research seems to be advisable for us in the think tank world. So the next question is from table 9.
Thank you, Paul. It's more of a comment. I do think you made a very, very important question when you said, well, if they're going to meet anyhow for the nuclear summit, why don't they talk about it in the G20, and that way they don't have to meet twice? Believe me, I know many leaders, and at least mine, they don't like to go summiting around. They rather sometimes stay home where they have a lot of problems. But sometimes you cannot miss being in that summit because otherwise, it's not the best thing to do. But I do believe Bruce gave a very straight answer. It's a problem of bureaucracy turfs, and why can't you have all in one inclusive summit? We are different ministries, we are different people in charge of different issues. And sometimes we lack even in a government to have this capacity to deal with nuclear issues at the same time that you deal with financial issues or with food issues. I mean, that's a basic point also with the development working group. The development working group is dealt by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Agriculture and food security. It's also dealt with the ministers of agriculture. So it's a problem of coordination, of really capacity within many of the states, or willingness among some of the states. Other issues that, you know, if it comes to that important summit, you will have to make a decision, and then there are going to be trade-offs between maybe you success in nuclear security, but then you have to take out imbalances, or, I mean, it's better sometimes to keep fragmented some of the issues to be able to move ahead. In the ideal world, obviously, you will have a huge omnibus summit and deal with everything. But I do find it's going to be very difficult, but it's undoubtedly there's a summit fatigue, and I don't really know how to solve it. You have proposed some important ideas since from being a longer summit to what Andres said, well, maybe bring out for launch a special speaker on some of the issues, which at least the leaders go back home with that concern in their heads. But really, that's the big challenge we are facing, not only for the Mexican summit, but I think for the strengthening the G20. I just want to say that I think the discussion is very useful. I know I have been insisting not to bring other issues to the table, and I just want to clarify, it's not that they're not important. I think it's not the place sometimes to deal with them, or the moment. Just imagine the same time we have taken today to deal with 3 issues. Besides that, I mean, we are all doing it on good faith, but when you go to those meetings, you have to finally have a statement on something. And this will take forever to deal with all the issues. And I don't know if they will have time, patience, and willingness to do it.
One of the things that strikes me, the G20 is different from the G7-8 in a lot of respects, but the agenda is not so different. You know, the G8 had to deal with economic issues of one kind or another. It had to deal with development. It did deal with nuclear security, nuclear safety, nuclear disarmament even. It dealt with all of those issues, and the leaders didn't allow the officials to say, we do this particular segment and we don't do anything else. So therefore, we want to have an agenda, we want to have a summit in which our issue, which is so important, can only be dealt with by us and by the leaders. And if there's something else, they should meet separately in another case. If I was a leader, I'd find that completely unpersuasive. You know, that's why we have cabinets, that's why we have Sherpas and sous-Sherpas and political directors and all of those kind of creatures. It's so that when the leaders get to a meeting, they have the support they need to be able to deal with it. To be in a position where you said, we can't deal with it, sir, because we didn't bring the right people along, because they weren't welcomed, I don't think that that's a persuasive case to be making. Or shouldn't be, anyway, that's another story. Oh, the questions seem to be increasing here. Could we do a quick round among us of where we think if each the research priorities ought to be in closing gaps, and then we'll finish with the questions we have, which may get answered in the process. Let's start with Trevor.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, I would focus on the issue of compliance. That's one of the most difficult things we have to face. It's very easy for states to reach agreements, but to actually have them comply with their obligations is quite another thing. So the 3 points I'd like to make here. One, we should think of measures that are less than legally binding if legally binding is impossible. Think of things like codes of conduct, confidence-building measures, as Paul mentioned. So there are many ways to skin a cat, so to speak, and they can often be quite effective because they can be below the political radar in a sense. I would also stress the issue of transparency versus confidentiality. There is a real dilemma here. Many people often act as if transparency is just a one-way street and it's a given good. But in fact, of course, it has to be traded off, particularly in my area, the nuclear area, with issues of confidentiality. And it's not clear where that line is always to be drawn. And states and the industry will, of course, draw it in the wrong direction from what I think is really the public interest. So there's a great question of how we actually measure the difference between transparency and confidentiality. And finally, monitoring compliance. It's often those who undertake the obligations who monitor themselves. Well, I think often that's not good enough. So we need to think about how one might monitor behavior through research, through non-governmental organizations, rather than leave it up to the parties themselves. If I could just give one specific example, the Carnegie Endowment have just negotiated an agreement between nuclear power plant suppliers to abide by safety, security, and non-proliferation norms. This is quite a unique thing. The industry have never done this before. The question arises, who is going to monitor their compliance with these new norms that they've adopted? And I think that's a role for research institutes like CIGI and non-governmental institutions.
Yes, well, I spoke about the cybersecurity field is pretty open for a lot of research activity. I would just signal one in particular, and that's the degree to which you can integrate this new technology and new environment into existing international legal frameworks and political structures. We don't have to create anew each time if we can find a consensus about subsuming the new processes into some existing vehicles, but that demands study. I emphasized about accountability mechanisms. Clearly, that has a lot to do with Trevor's emphasis on how we enhance the compliance record of states. I think the two have to work mutually to reinforce one another, and I think that's a very important area going forward to find practical models of arrangements that seem to work and to see the extent to which they can be applied to other fields.
Yeah, you know, global governance is a fairly new issue in a country like Korea. So it's very important to build a domestic political base for a supporting global governance policy. And South Korea has been fairly active in the last 2 years. If you ask me what will happen to South Korea in the next government, I'm fairly skeptical because our G20 policy revolved around one person, and our climate change policy also revolves around another person when they leave the government. And I'm not sure whether South Korea will maintain their interests. Two. I'm just, yeah. So keeping the public interested in this issue, I think this is a problem everywhere. I think CIGI is already doing this, doing work on this, but I think this is a really important issue in emerging countries where global governance issues are new and global responsibilities are a new idea for them. So building a domestic base for global governance policy in emerging market, I think that's sharing best practices and doing research on how to improve that. I think it would be very helpful for people like us in emerging countries trying to promote this.
I don't think this is just a question for emerging countries. I think finding ways of engaging the public in policy development so that they support it, that's an issue that practically everybody is trying to cope with. And it does raise the kind of issue about the use of social media and using technology to try to get people more directly engaged. Thorsten, please.
Three substantive points on research I would make quickly. One is institutional design, that whenever leaders find themselves confronting with having to start a new institution, that researchers can actually give them solid advice on what could work and what couldn't. This has been not really fully taken into account in research. Second, institutional effectiveness and evaluation, echoing some of your concerns. Third, I would say, I always thought it would be nice, we have indices, rankings on competitiveness, on corruption. It would be nice if there were a ranking on the kind of global public goods contribution that each country makes, each actor makes, that we can have some hard data kind of ranking the contributions to the global good. And the fourth final point—
We could have used that before the UN Security Council.
And the fourth and final point, in doing all of this to really broaden the base for the research on global governance. As you just said, global governance is a new term. I mean, you still cannot pronounce it in the US in most quarters, but it's a new term for a lot of kind of middle powers, rising powers, and so on, to really broaden the think tank and research base into these countries, to bring them into the discussion. And this will help us, and I think this will also help ultimately to improve global governance.
David?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a research agenda, but I'm an advocate rather than a scholar. My observation about our discussion is just in all the discussions we've been having, think about all the various options leaders have to engage with an issue. We've talked about making a collective statement, launching consideration of an emerging issue, forming working groups, conducting basic education on issues that leaders are fuzzy about, prioritizing and delving into issues. Lourdes talked about getting down to 3 pillars from 9 or 45, depending on how you count. And that's what I find missing from the debate about the agenda, is a sense of all of these different options and modes of engagement for the process and for the leaders. I think probably Lourdes and I would agree that you have to be careful, for instance, in setting up working groups, because it entails such a responsibility of monitoring and follow-through. I actually do see a burden of proof for candidate proposed topics for the agenda, which I describe as this: the need to articulate a theory of change for how the leaders and the process will help advance an issue from where it is. And then in conclusion, I'd like to nominate another issue to stop talking about, aside from Doha, and that is the issue of a secretariat.
My candidate is to take a look at at Doha, to take a look at climate change, to take a look at disarmament, arms control and disarmament questions, and to see what's common in all of those, if there is anything, which is blocking progress in the negotiations. To what extent are these things sui generis, and to what extent are they problems that are somehow overcomable? So we have time for, the bus is leaving in 6 minutes and 23 seconds, I think it says here. And we have a question from table 2 and 2 questions from table 8. So let's take them all and then see how we respond to them if we do.
Thanks, Paul. Very quickly then, on gaps. It seems to me when I think back over the last 50 years of international security, while norms and institutions developed, so much of the implementation took place at the regional level. And we haven't discussed at all the relationship between the G20 and either existing or potentially new regional organizations, which seem to be emerging in various ways. Certainly in Asia, it's there, and it's likely to occur elsewhere. So I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on the relationship between this issue of the location of so much of the actual implementation of security concerns still located within regions.
Table 8 has 2 questions, and then we're finished with the questions.
Actually, Paul, I had just a brief comment that I wanted to.
Tom, if it's you, it's 3 questions if you want.
Which I tried to turn it off, but it didn't work. But I've got a great deal of sympathy for Lourdes in light of all of the suggestions for additions to the agenda. And I mean, the question we have to ask ourselves is not whether an issue is important to us, not whether we feel there's a lack of progress, but what is the compelling reason why leaders have to address it? I mean, and that's the argument we would have to make to them. I mean, leaders are going to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and those of us who have been close enough know that they do that. And sometimes it gets reflected in the communique, sometimes it doesn't. Most of what's in the communique, in fact, is not a part of their discussions. Lourdes mentioned the risk of bureaucratization, and I think that's something we've got to be very conscious of. I'll date myself, but back when Gordon Berry and I were Sherpas and I was G7 deputy,
I mean, at that point, there was no, I mean, there was a G7 finance deputy, period. If there was an issue to be addressed, we established an ad hoc group, it did a report, and it disbanded. I mean, after I left, they then established there were deputies, there were deputies, they all established their own agenda, and it bore little relationship to what, in fact, leaders were concerned about. And I'm concerned, in fact, we're seeing that a bit again with the French presidency, with the 44 working groups, and you know, as I've engaged in conversations over the course of this year, I mean, a number of times people said, well, I mean, what are the French really trying to achieve? Why are all of these groups? And I mean, one example is agricultural ministers meeting to talking about food security. And as Jennifer Clapp said, you know, they met, they came out with a nice sounding communique. In fact, it was not connected to authority they had in terms of speculation or in terms of where leaders were, and created expectations which now have been dashed because it wasn't rooted in anything. So I think we've got to be very careful in recommending what should be added. I think we should be focusing more on what might be taken away. And I think we have to think that there is a compelling argument before we suggest leaders take it up.
Thanks. I had a two-hander, but the system doesn't allow for a two-hander. So I was really very impressed with Paul's persistence on making the case that there are some very serious issues for mankind, and if leaders don't address it, who will? My reaction is that at the moment, unlike in the economic and financial sphere, the G8 does not seem to be giving any indication that they think that these issues should be shunted to the G20. And on the other side, I find no appetite amongst the big emerging players to put this issue on the agenda. So as we heard from Jongryn, there might be some middle powers that might have an interest, but I don't think that they will actually have the impact. So at the moment, given the overload on the agenda and the lack of appetite, I think you know, the action will still have to be primarily in the flawed Security Council.
Yeah, I'm not trying to belittle the Security Council, nor do I, in Tom's case, am I suggesting that leaders, you know, that we burden leaders. And obviously, these are questions that leaders need to make, you know, the test has to be whether leaders are necessary for the proper advancement of an important issue. But I guess the case I'm making is it isn't. These are important issues. And it doesn't make sense to me to bring the leaders together for 16 hours. You know, they used to get together in the Treaty of Versailles. They were there for, you know, 16 weeks at a time, not 16 hours. Times have changed. But, you know, why are we can't put anything else on the agenda, I guess, because they're not going to be there beyond 4 o'clock. So why don't we make the agenda a little bit longer and take advantage of their being there and pollute the atmosphere less by flying? Anyway, I think we've had all of the questions. We've got 20 seconds left until the bus leaves. So thank you very much. And we're now at the point. I'll give you my favorite UN saying. We're now at the point where everything has been said, it just hasn't yet been said by everybody. Thanks.